Let me start with a knock knock joke. Actually, I heard it once from a Buddhist monk. So there's a junior monk, and he goes to a senior monk's room and knocks at the door. So there is knock knock, and the senior monk says, "Who is this?" To which the junior monk replies, "That is why I'm here. I want to know who am I." So that's the kind of humor you get with monks. So anyway, that's the point of today's conversation, and today I'm going to discuss the Vedanta philosophy. And there are a lot of ways to define this philosophy, what it is all about. But if you were to summarize it in one sentence, the whole philosophy really probes and explores the question of the self. Who am I? And it also tries to give you the explanations and answers. Many of you are probably already familiar with the term Vedanta. And if you know Sanskrit or Hindi, you would know that Vedanta literally means the end of the Vedas. So in some ways, the Vedanta, they form the concluding parts of the Vedas, which are the sacred scriptures in Hinduism. But as we have discussed so far, there are different schools of Hinduism and different schools of Indian philosophy. And when you see these schools, there are, as we have discussed, certain orthodox schools like yoga, and then there's also heterodoxy. For example, in case of Jainism or Buddhism, those are non-theistic. That is, there is no concept of God. So Vedanta is more of a orthodox school of philosophy, which means there is a concept of God. But once again, we have to be careful here. These Indian schools of philosophy, or in some ways you can say Indian religions or Hinduism, they do talk about the idea of God, and they do pursue the path of spirituality, but they do it slightly differently. For example, when you see yoga philosophy, which we've discussed in the previous podcast, you notice that there is this idea of God, but that's not really the primary aspect of it. The primary aspect is the understanding of the self, and the secondary aspect is God. Through understanding God, you understand yourself. That is what you do in yoga. And that's really an interesting way of looking at spirituality or religions in general. Because this is where a lot of people who probably don't understand the Indic culture, Hindu culture, and the different religions in India, they probably think that the idea of religion is always about God. But as we'll see, this is just one way of pursuing a religion or spirituality. So one way of pursuing spirituality is through the path of the worship of God, which is sometimes referred as Bhakti Yoga in India. That is Bhakti, the worship. So that is one way to follow spirituality. The other way to do the same thing is through this quest of understanding the self, which is what a lot of Indian philosophies and Indian religions do. They start with the inquiry. Like in case of Buddhism, you start with the inquiry of understanding the self. What is it? Where does suffering come from? How can we alleviate this suffering? So these are two entirely opposite approaches. In the end, as you will see, the approaches lead to something similar as a result, but to begin with, these two approaches, they are just poles apart. So let me make it simpler for you. Consider this. You'll find generally two kinds of people. People who believe, let's say, in the idea of God, in religions, and people who are skeptics, who disbelieve. So people who believe, for them, the path of religion is really simple. It starts with the belief in God. And from there on, things become really, really simple, because you can always keep coming back to that idea of faith, that you always have the idea of God no matter what happens to you, and you find that comfort. You find certain amount of strength and courage knowing that God is always there. So the first step is the hardest one with that approach, that is to find belief. A lot of people find it relatively easy, but a lot of other people struggle with it. They just cannot take this first step, because we, the rational people in the 21st century, we need logic, reasons, facts and figures. So for a lot of us, this is the toughest thing to do. Because if somebody comes to us and tells us about God, we are going to ask this very simple question: where is God? And to this question, a lot of religions respond with the point that just believe that God exists, just do that. And I'm sure it's not that easy for a lot of you. It just doesn't come. You can't really start believing something when you don't find any rational basis for this. So what could be the approach for such a person? Approach to pursue spiritual path. So then we come to the alternative path, where we start with the idea of self. That is, we don't know about God. We don't know whether God exists or not. Even let's start with the assumption that God doesn't exist, right? But what we know as a matter of fact is that we exist. You know that you exist. Everything else in the universe can be unreal. It is possible that you are probably dreaming in this moment. You're not in reality. It is also possible that you are probably in some kind of matrix and you are unable to see it. All of that is possible. All of the things that you see around you could be unreal. But one thing that you cannot deny at this moment is that you are a conscious being. You are experiencing it. Even if it is an illusion, even if all of it is fake, all of it is some kind of matrix, but what you cannot deny is the nature of yourself, that there is a self. And we can investigate further what is the nature of the self, what is it exactly, is it also an illusion? So you can investigate it further, but you cannot deny it. So for those people who find it difficult to believe in God who lives in the heavens or somewhere else, for them it becomes easy to start with this approach. And this is exactly the heart of the Vedantic philosophy, that to understand the self, who are you? And this question comes again and again in the Upanishads. Upanishads are the main Vedantic texts. There are a lot of them, literally more than hundreds, but for our purposes, we generally refer to either 10 or 13 of them, depending on which school of thought we are going with. So from these Upanishads, a lot of these ideas of the self, the nature of the self, they come. There are stories, There are conversations, and sometimes there are just assertions. There are simple answers. For example, the shortest of them all is the Mandukya Upanishad. And it's really, really short. Let me narrate it to you, its English version, and then let's see what does it say. So this Upanishad, Mandukya Upanishad, it starts with the explanation of the sound Om, and that's the symbolic part of it. But through this sound, through this idea, it tells you about the different states of consciousness, consciousness that you have when you are awake, when you're dreaming, when you're in deep sleep or otherwise. So let me read it first, and then let's see what does it talk about. On the greatness of Om. Om stands for the supreme reality. It is a symbol for what was, what is, and what shall be. Om represents also what lies beyond past, present, and future. Brahman is all, and the Self is Brahman. This Self has 4 states of consciousness. The first is called Vaishvanara, in which one lives with all the senses turned outward, aware only of the external world. Tejas is the name of the second, the dreaming state in which, with the senses turned inward, one enacts the impressions of past deeds and present desires. The third state is called prajna. There is no separateness, but the sleeper is not conscious of this. Let him become conscious in prajna, and it will open the door to the state of abiding joy. Prajna, all-powerful and all-knowing, dwells in the hearts of all as the ruler. Prajna is the source and end of all. The fourth is the superconscious state called Turiya, neither inward nor outward, beyond the senses and the intellect, in which there is none other than the Lord. He is the supreme goal of life. He is infinite peace and love. Realize Him. Turiya is represented by Om. Though indivisible, it has 3 sounds. A or stands for Vaishvanara. Those who know this through mastery of the senses obtain the great fruit of their desires and attain greatness. U or O indicates Tejas. Those who know this by mastering even in their dreams become established in wisdom. In their family, everyone leads the spiritual life. M or Ma corresponds to prajna. Those who know this by stilling the mind find their true stature and inspire everyone around to grow. The mantra Om stands for the supreme state of Turiya, without parts beyond birth and death, symbol of everlasting joy. Those who know Om as the Self become the Self. Truly, they become the Self. Om, peace, peace, peace. So, in a very clear and concise way, this Upanishad talks about the states of consciousness. The first is, of course, the waking state, which we are aware of. When we spend our days, we are doing something or sitting still listening, talking, whatever we are doing, we are aware. That is the everyday experience. So when we work on this state, then we achieve great things in life. The second thing is the second state of consciousness they talk about is the dream state. Now, the dream state is something which is when we are sleeping and watching the dream. So, although it's not really taking place in reality in the objective world, our experience is very much real. And they also suggest that these dreams are pretty much the result of our desires, our past impressions, and all of them are manifested in the dreams. And then we get to the third state of consciousness when we are not really dreaming, we are in a deep sleep, but still there is something that is experiencing the deep sleep. For example, when you go to sleep and there are certain things that you remember after the sleep. Let's say you remember the dream, but sometimes you don't remember anything. But you still know you had a good sleep. How do you know that? So that awareness, even though it's not really obvious, but it's still there. That awareness, they're talking about the third state of consciousness, which is the deep sleep. And then it is suggested that there is also awareness beyond these states. And that is the ultimate reality. So in Vedanta, that ultimate reality is generally is in some ways conceived as, let's say, some kind of idea of God. Although it's different when we speak of different schools of Vedanta. But still, it is that something that is beyond the idea of the superficial self or the matter that we generally talk about. This supreme consciousness that is there. And you see how we connect these two now. We start with the inquiry of the self. We don't start with the idea of God. But then we get there. We get to the point of God, which is now we are connecting it with the idea of self. So of course there are different schools of Vedantic philosophy. For example, in Shankara's Advaita philosophy, Advaita is non-dualism. So there we find that there is a connection in all of it. So that is the self that we are talking about here. That is the supreme self. There is no distinction. The supreme self is there, and it is now manifesting everywhere in you and I, in almost everything in the world. Not just almost, in everything. Every material, non-material things, whatever is out there, the supreme Brahman, or whatever you call it, that is manifesting. And that is Advaita. In certain other schools, for example in Ramanuja's, you find slight difference. Here we see that there are different selves, that is, you as a self or you as a soul, whatever you call it, your identity, that is distinct from me and everything else. But then as a whole, when we look at the entire universe, there is a supreme consciousness. But it is a combination of different souls, they coming together, and then in some abstract way, this supreme consciousness is being formed. So this idea differs depending on the school of Advaita we are talking about. But the most popular of these ideas, as I said, is the Advaita, the non-dualism. Non-dualism is also there in, you'll find in Buddhist philosophy, in fact in many other schools of Hinduism. But then there it is explained in a different way. So Buddhists, for example, would say that all the things in the universe, you and I, everything else, we are all connected. But as such, there is no permanent self, which you can call God or Supreme Consciousness. It's just that you and I are different impermanent agents who are exchanging matter and constantly interacting with each other. And that's all there is. There is no underlying deeper reality or deeper consciousness. But in Vedanta, you find the opposite, that there is this deeper reality. There is the deeper self that we are talking about. We're not talking about the brain, the mind, or the ego that we generally identify with, or our bodies. We're not that. In fact, this is a common phrase that you find in all the Upanishads, that you're not that or you are that. These two phrases are very much there. So they constantly remind you to not identify with your impermanent self, and instead identify with the permanent self, the eternal self. While, as I said, in Buddhism, there is no such thing as eternal self. So this is the idea of Vedantic philosophy. Mostly, as I said, it talks about spirituality, talks about the supreme reality, and it gives a number of examples, a number of stories to explain this point. And let me now quote a brief passage from Kena Upanishad, which beautifully talks about this idea of supreme consciousness, or Brahman, or you can call that by any other name. And that makes very interesting point about the idea of consciousness. Now, let me narrate this. That which cannot be expressed by speech, but by which speech is expressed, that alone is known as Brahman. And not that which people here worship. That which cannot be apprehended by the mind, but by which they say the mind is apprehended. That alone is known as Brahman, and not that which people here worship. That which cannot be perceived by the eye, but by which the eye is perceived. That alone is known as Brahman, and not that which people here worship. That which cannot be heard by the ear, but by which the hearing is perceived. That alone is known as Brahman, and not that which people here worship. So you see, here they're talking about slightly deeper idea of God. And they're not talking about God in the sense that God is living somewhere else, but it's the ultimate consciousness inside you, through which you are perceiving the world. And it's not merely your senses, it's not merely your brain that is doing the processing part, but just the subjective awareness, which is what we call as consciousness. The subjectivity of your experience, that is referred as the supreme consciousness, or Brahman here. And in fact, Upanishads are full of such examples of, or stories of consciousness. And nowhere else I think you would find in any other literature such beautiful and deep explanations of the consciousness. And to make this point even more simpler to understand, they also give this example of, let's say there is gold existing in its metallic form. Now you get this gold and you can make some kind of ring made out of it. And you take the other part of it and you make some bracelet out of it. And then you also make certain necklaces. Now, initially what you had gold, and it has now been transformed into a ring, a bracelet, and a number of necklaces. Now, the point is, all of them, although appear in different forms, they're still just another form of gold. And that's the point here, that all of us are made in different forms, with different compositions, but we are made out of essentially the same thing. And you can talk about it in two different ways. You can talk about it in terms of matter, that is, the matter is arranging itself in different atoms are arranging themselves in different ways, different compositions, and then we get one object, we get human beings, we get animals, plants, all the things that are out there in the universe. But you can also talk about it in a more spiritual way, that there is your awareness, your consciousness, your soul, the subjectivity, and then there is my subjectivity, if at all that exists, and we know that exists because the only thing that we can be sure of in this world, as I said previously, it is of our consciousness, that we are conscious beings and we are having these experiences that we are having. So, your consciousness, my consciousness. So the point here is, there is no such thing like that your consciousness or my consciousness. It's just the consciousness, it's flowing out there, and it is experiencing the world in different forms. So if there are soap bubbles in air, and there is air inside each one of them, but the air is air. It belongs to that particular soap bubble for a brief moment. That is not its true nature. So the air in itself, when it is in different bubbles, it may seem that air is what is contained in those bubbles. But as soon as the bubble disappears, the air is once again free, it's floating. And that is the nature of the consciousness. At least that is how it is perceived and explained in the Upanishads. And that is what they are trying to, these sages, these teachers, they are trying to teach us here. That once we see this reality, it liberates us in so many ways. It takes away all the stresses of the life. You don't really care, then you go to heaven or hell or anywhere else. You don't really care, you are born or reborn again in, what is going to happen, what has happened, because you are a free soul. You are just the pure consciousness. That is all what you are. And once you identify with it, once you stop identifying with the temporary things, such as your body or your mind, which are going to inevitably hurt you, then you feel liberated. And that has been the ultimate goal of all the different schools of Indian philosophy. That is to overcome suffering. Another consequence of this philosophy, non-dualism in general, is that it changes the morality. And if we pursue this idea of morality and ethics into even law, then we are going to have very different societies than we currently have. And that can be debated whether that is going to be fair, but that is definitely a case here. Because what happens in that case, if your metaphysical ideas are based on non-dualism, that there is the ultimate reality, you and I are not really different, So, for example, if I am killing you or I am killing myself, I am committing the equally dreadful sin. So, I might deserve the equal punishments in both cases. Similarly, if I am hurting another life form, whether it's a human being or an animal, I might be guilty of committing the same crime. Because when we talk about the idea of human rights and place them above the animal rights, essentially we go by the Christian idea. That is, there is something sacred in human beings which is slightly above than the other life forms. But when we follow this idea of non-dualism and these specific schools of Hinduism, then it's very hard to make a case for human rights and keep them above animal rights. In that case, I would say it's very hard to ignore animal rights. So those are the important consequences that we are going to have if we pursue these philosophies in our lives. And I'm sure a lot of people already do pursue these philosophies. In fact, most of the practices you see in India in different ways, even in different religions, in Jains, in Hindus, you'll find this connection that the idea of non-dualism and the idea of different schools of Vedantic philosophy, they are very much there. One of the interesting things about the Vedantic philosophy is that it has cherry-picked a lot of things from other schools. So eventually it has evolved into something more practical and slightly more richer than the other schools of philosophy. So that's why it is pretty much everywhere in India, and you can see it. So that is all for just the basics of Vedantic philosophy. If you want to read more about the Vedantic philosophy, particularly Advaita, then I would say you must read the commentaries of Swami Vivekananda. I think he provides the most clear and interesting explanations. So you can read that for yourself and learn about it yourself. But if you're just going to go ahead and read the Upanishads, simply the translations or some brief commentaries, those books are also available. And they're not really that hard to read. You can do certain reflections. You can search those questions one by one as you're reading those texts. And you'll be able to understand. It won't be that hard. But I would still say go with the commentaries rather than simple translations. So that's all for now. Don't forget to subscribe and share the podcast. And do visit www.kalampedia.org. Thank you.